I don't think I said good morning. Thank you. Well, good morning to everyone. I think we've welcomed people as you've come in generally. And it's my pleasure to also welcome Chris LaTondresse, who has been working for the good of Minnesotans for a lot of years. Chris, I just verified for sure. I thought I remembered that you were on the Hopkins School Board when I was on
That's
the
right.
school board. And then he went on to be Hennepin County Commissioner and now to be the CEO of Beacon. And thank you for all of that service to our communities, I guess I should say. Anyway, and today Chris is going to talk about permanent supportive housing in the Twin Cities, and he's going to give us the latest on funding and what is happening because it's hard to keep up on the latest on everything. So Chris, it's so important, this work that you do, and the permanent supportive housing seems like a wonderful opportunity, and hopefully we can keep that going. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you, Chris, for being with us.
Well, thanks so much, Colleen. And the gratitude goes in both directions. I just want to thank the Edina League of Women's Voters for just the extraordinary civic leadership that you provide, both in Edina, but for the state of Minnesota and really for the nation. I don't think it's any surprise that the West Metro sees uncommon, even unprecedented levels of civic participation, voting, participation in the last census. And that is a direct result of the work that you all do every day, just connecting neighbors to our most cherished and I would even say sacred responsibilities as Americans and citizens. So I just profound gratitude for you all in the way that you're keeping that flame alive in our time as it's our responsibility to do in every time. Well, here's where I'm going to start today. And whoever's driving the presentation, if you can pull up the opening slide here. I know that the title of today's presentation that was circulated was about supportive housing, and that is certainly at the center of today's story. So we're going to be talking about that today. But I actually want to start with a more audacious claim,
Mhm.
and it's this: the truth is that we know how to end homelessness. What we lack is not resources, but the political and moral will to adequately fund and sufficiently scale proven solutions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Hopefully, that's something that you're persuaded of before we start today's conversation. But if you're not now, hopefully you are by the time we wrap up today's discussion, or at least know a little bit more about the state of homelessness in Minnesota and nationwide, and what we can do about it as a community and as individuals. If you could go to the next slide. What I'm actually going to do here, if possible, and this might interfere with the recording, you might need to chunk this up a little bit. Elizabeth, can you paste the link to the Losing Sleep, Losing Home YouTube video in the chat? And I'm not going to have us stream that live because when we do that on Zoom, it kind of interferes with the music and whatnot. But this is a short video; it's about 3 minutes long, and I'm going to have folks go on mute and watch this video all concurrently. I'm going to do sort of a countdown to ground us in the moment and as a backdrop for the conversation that we're going to have about homelessness and proven solutions, including supportive housing. So I'm going to give folks a minute to get that queued up. Maybe show of hands or give me a thumbs up once you have it pulled up, and then I'll have us all hit play at the same time. That way we'll all be synced up and we'll wrap up at about the same time. Can I get thumbs up across screens once you've got that queued up? Looks like folks mostly have that queued up. All right. Ready or not, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and play the video. All right. I see that we've just started the recording again for folks that are watching this later on. We just watched a video. We'll include the the link with the video of this presentation as well. So that was a video. We'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about what I describe as the federal retreat and rupture that proven solutions on homelessness are experiencing right now. Certainly the organizations that hold these solutions, but most importantly, our friends and neighbors overcoming homelessness that these solutions serve. But we'll circle back to that. Where I want to start today is again with this audacious claim that we know how to end homelessness, but what we lack is not resources, but the moral and political will to adequately fund and scale proven solutions. And I'll just say this, whether this homelessness is an issue that's getting a lot of attention these days and for good reason, whether you're concerned about this issue because you've experienced housing instability yourself, or you're just moved by human compassion, or you're just concerned about the community economic, public safety impacts of homelessness encampments. I've got good news for you. There is a path out of this. And at the center of this story is a model called permanent supportive housing. It's safe, stable housing with on-site services for our friends and neighbors overcoming homelessness. And in fact, Minnesota has been leading the way with this model for years, for decades. And we'll talk a little bit about Minnesota's role in this and where we go next. And just as a pop quiz here for those looking at the pictures closely, does anyone know what that building is pictured here on this slide? Who wants to chime in? Well, it says it right there on the building. This is 66 West. It's 39 units of supportive housing for youth overcoming homelessness. It's one of three youth-focused properties that Beacon operates. That's the single largest holding of youth supportive housing in the state of Minnesota. And many Edina community leaders and congregations played a pivotal role in bringing these homes into the world. And just so show of hands here, if you played a role, whether as an advocate, as a donor, as a volunteer with mutual aid, either in the past or present, just show of hands so we can give you some recognition. No surprise that we've got some friends of 66 West in the room here, and I'm just pleased to report that we're at close to 100% occupancy. We continue to have a really strong working relationship with our service provider on site. Simpson Housing provides the services and case management there. Youth continue to go on, achieve housing stability there and get the skills and resources and stability that they need to thrive beyond 66 West. So it's a good news story that hasn't been told enough. If you want to go to the next slide, whoever's driving for us here. So again, I mentioned that we know how to end homelessness. So right here in Hennepin County, this approach has helped move 9,500 people from homelessness to housing and reduce unsheltered homelessness by 35% just over the past 5 years. So I think that's one of the things that's important to anchor on. I think people have this perception that homelessness is actually getting worse in our communities. And there's certainly broader affordability pressures around housing that I think a lot of us are feeling. But when it comes to homelessness specifically, when it comes to unsheltered homelessness, people sleeping outside, or just homelessness more broadly, whether it's people sleeping outside or people in shelter or transitional housing, we're actually seeing a year-over-year decrease because of really smart, targeted investments that we've been making as Minnesotans over the past several decades. And at the center of that story, again, is supportive housing. It's in fact part of how we have functionally ended veterans' homelessness in 86 of 87 Minnesota counties. And as I mentioned before, it's a good news story that hasn't been told enough. It's also true, and now we're going to shift, and I'm going to ground us in some of the data around homelessness in the Twin Cities metro area, that at exactly the time we are seeing progress, these solutions are at greater risk of unraveling around us than ever before. And that's where each of us can play a role. Go to the next slide, please. So I think it sort of begs this question. If we know what works, why do we still see homelessness in our community? And I'm going to just ground us in some of the data and the reality that we're confronting. If you go to the next slide. First, this is a snapshot of homelessness in the Twin Cities today. Over 5,500 people experiencing homelessness. And this number comes, and you can see it broken out there by county: Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and then we talked about the 7-county metro area, the collar counties around Hennepin and Ramsey. The source for this is the 2025 point in time count. Has anybody heard of the point in time count before? Familiar with what that is? So basically, every single year, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, requires continuums of care, and I'll come back to this in a minute, continuums of care, COCs, to conduct an annual point-in-time count. It's a PIT count. I just threw a lot of acronyms at you: HUD, COC, PIT. In Minnesota, this PIT count is essentially an annual census of everyone experiencing homelessness in Minnesota. It's carried out by, we have 11 COCs, or continuums of care, in Minnesota. If you think of the map of Minnesota and divide it into 11 pieces, these COCs are essentially these local coordination bodies or tables that are often comprised of, like in Hennepin County, the Hennepin COC is Hennepin County, the city of Minneapolis, and the array of shelter and supportive housing providers that hold solutions on homelessness, and they help steer together federal investments in homelessness locally. And this will become important later in the presentation as we talk about the role of federal funding in homelessness solutions and this moment of federal retreat and rupture. But it's important to understand there are 11 of these COCs in Minnesota that conduct an annual point-in-time count, or the census. And that count is what the federal government uses, HUD uses, to shape the formula of the funding that it brings or invests in Minnesota and around the country to go to locally driven and selected solutions on homelessness. And there are roughly 400 of these COCs, or these coordinating tables, around the country. And it's also important to know the PIT total includes people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, so folks sleeping outside, and people staying in emergency shelters and transitional housing. Because by definition, if you're staying in a shelter or you're in transitional housing, you're still homeless until you achieve that housing stability. And that's an important concept here when we're talking about the relationship between homelessness and permanent housing, because by definition, how we end homelessness is through housing, by definition. Next slide. We also know that our housing crisis is a crisis of racial injustice, which reflects harmful, deep, and persistent disparities across Minnesota. And this is just a really staggering snapshot from the Walz administration's strategic plan on homelessness. It's called Crossroads to Justice. It shows that BIPOC Minnesotans are significantly more likely to experience homelessness than their white neighbors. And you can see that Native and Black residents are at greatest risk. Those are the lines that are up and to the right, sort of on the most extreme trajectory. What it shows is if you're a Black household in Minnesota, you're 12 times more likely than a white household to experience homelessness. And Native households, at the time that they published this report, 28 times more likely. That's now grown to 32 times more likely. And I'll say that this is certainly consistent with what we see in Beacon housing. Over 90% of Beacon residents are BIPOC, with especially high concentrations of Native residents in our housing. And it's one of the reasons why we've partnered, in particular with some of our tribes, both Red Lake Nation and the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community around some of our developments, so we can target some of those units to our Native friends, neighbors, and relatives overcoming homelessness. Next slide. This is where we're going to move a little out of the homelessness data and talk about the broader affordability crisis and its relationship to homelessness. Right now in the Twin Cities metro area, 45% of households are housing cost burden, meaning they spend more than a third of their income on housing. And with the sunset of the COVID era federal eviction moratorium and the end of emergency rental assistance dollars, we have actually seen where we have seen a growth in homelessness is actually with family homelessness as the eviction moratorium's been lifted and these rental assistance dollars have gone away. This basically means another way of thinking about this is nearly half of Twin Cities households are just one financial crisis away from housing instability. And we don't have to look far to understand why, if you go to the next slide. To me, this is one of the most staggering data points, and it's the one that we'll end on as we then transition to the broader context. There are over 112,000 extremely low-income households in the Twin Cities. That's households at 30% of the area median income and below. That's essentially folks at or below the poverty line. And there are only 40,000 units of housing that would be available to a household at that income level. So that is a staggering 72,000 unit gap that directly intersects with several other crisis level threats that affect our collective goals for housing stability. And where this connects in particular with homelessness is that the GAO, this is the Federal Government Accountability Office, found that for every $100 rent increase, there is a 9% increase in homelessness. So I'm going to say that again because it's an important data point. For every $100 rent increase, there is a 9% increase in homelessness. So certainly one part of how we solve homelessness is in ensuring that we prevent people from experiencing homelessness to begin with, which is often through rent supports and higher incomes. But for folks then who have fallen into homelessness, who then need help overcoming homelessness, this is where our supportive housing system kicks in and comes into play. And this, between these four data points that I've shared with you, is really the housing affordability and homelessness crisis in a nutshell. Next slide, please. So Minnesota's supportive housing sector is on the front lines of addressing these gaps and disparities. And here's what we've been experiencing together to give you a look under the hood. We're seeing a complex and rapidly evolving community need on housing and homelessness, a mental health crisis that's made worse by COVID-19 and the aftershocks of the pandemic economy, a deadly and rapidly evolving opioid epidemic, pressure on organizations, even distress, I think it's fair to say, holding proven solutions as we've seen costs increase and revenues decrease, which has opened a gap on a system that has already been, as I described earlier, inadequately funded and insufficiently scaled. So any organizations in this space, Beacon included, and a lot of our peers in this housing and homelessness space, particularly with a focus on supportive housing, include other organizations you may have heard of, like Catholic Charities, Center City Housing in Greater Minnesota, here in the Twin Cities metro area in Greater Minnesota, Common Bond, PPL, Aon, Alliance Housing, Agate. These are all organizations that hold these solutions. Talk to any of these leaders leading these organizations. They will tell you that this work has never been more challenging than it is now. And in fact, a subset of us recently commissioned a report that showed for every unit of supportive housing being operated in the state of Minnesota, there is a $2,000 per unit annual gap that has opened up on us since the beginning of the pandemic, just over the last 5-year period. So that's what we're trying to hold on to as we protect what we've built that's working and contemplate growing it moving forward. Finally, and this is where we'll go next, is this context of what I describe as federal retreat and rupture, which we'll talk about more here in a moment. Some of you may have seen, I see we've hopped ahead to this slide here. So some of you may have seen Canadian, you can go ahead to this next slide, that's fine. Canadian Prime Minister at Davos a couple of weeks ago gave a speech about how changes in Washington have affected the reliability of the United States as a trusted, reliable actor in global affairs. And Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney described this not as a transition, but as a rupture. Not as a transition, but as a rupture. And I think that's one thing that's important to understand is we're experiencing a version of that here in the US as well. And we've all experienced an amplified version of that here in Minnesota in particular, as we've seen a government that all of us rely on to play a proactive and positive role in providing our basic safety nets and investments for human and civic flourishing, actually stand in the way and interfere with these solutions. And that's been especially true in supportive housing and the federal government's role in holding proven solutions on homelessness. In November, HUD, which is, again, the Housing and Urban Development, announced devastating budget cuts and rule changes, unprecedented in their scale and speed, that directly threaten over 170,000 Americans and 3,900 Minnesotans who have successfully overcome homelessness, who are living in supportive housing, who are healing, recovering, and putting their lives back together in a way that makes our whole community stronger. We've been describing this as a code red for decades of bipartisan progress on proven solutions to ending homelessness nationwide. The Star Tribune called it a 5-alarm fire for supportive housing. And a little bit about how this system works and the role of federal funding in not just supportive housing, but homelessness solutions overall. HUD has a program called COC. It stands for Continuum of Care. It's about a $3.5 billion annual program that represents the lion's share of federal investments in homelessness solutions nationwide. And how those dollars are administered is 90% of those dollars. So if you think of a pie chart, 90% of those $3.6 billion are not actually administered directly out of Washington. They are granted directly to these 400 COCs nationally, these continuums of care, these local coordinating bodies who are closest to the communities they serve and know and understand how to put these really precious but limited public dollars to their best and highest use to overcome homelessness, because that's why these dollars exist. It's no surprise then that local administrators, so 90% again of these funds are administered locally. And here in the Twin Cities metro area, we have 3 continuums of care. Hennepin is a continuum of care, Ramsey is a continuum of care, and the collar counties are their own continuum of care. It's sort of like a donut. Each of these get a federal allocation that's in part informed by that PIT count we talked about earlier. And these local coordinating bodies make decisions about how to spend those dollars. Any guesses, at least currently, now this is not what HUD wants, they're trying to move in a different direction. Any guesses what percentage of those $3.6 billion go to supportive housing? What percentage? Who thinks it's over 40%? I'll just give the right answer. It's over 80%. Over 80% of these HUD funds, that is the principal federal source for homelessness, go to supportive housing. Why? We'll talk about this in a moment, because it works. It is proven and evidence-based. It is high return on investment and fiscally responsible, and it's highly accountable, in contrast to some of the models HUD is contemplating right now, steering billions of dollars into unaccountable LLCs and for-profit organizations. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But what this represents, so this is the model that has been built up over decades. In fact, some of these first investments started back in the Reagan administration. The Interagency Council on Homelessness, when we talk about bipartisan progress on proven solutions, some of these early investments started under the Reagan administration, including standing up the Interagency Council on Homelessness. Housing first became a principal strategy with significant HUD investments during the George W. Bush administration. Here in Minnesota, some of our first housing first and supportive housing developments uh, were shaped during the Plenty administration under the leadership of then Housing Commissioner Tim Marks, who went on to be CEO of Catholic Charities and has served in other roles. So when we talk about this being a bipartisan, cost-effective, proven solution, this is what we're talking about. And HUD is trying to reverse all of that. They are trying to, number one, shift so that 90% of these funds, rather than flowing directly to these local, highly accountable COCs, that 70% of that funding would stay in Washington with individual political appointee bureaucrats making decisions over those dollars for everybody. And then the remaining 30% that would get shaped by the COCs would cap at 30% what they're allowed to spend on supportive housing. Essentially, that represents nationwide over an 80% cut on federal funding for permanent supportive housing. Why are they doing this? It's a real head scratcher. We can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. So how Beacon has been orienting to this moment and orienting others to this moment is we immediately helped launch and coordinate a nationwide strategy that included 3 pillars: legal, policy organizing and advocacy, and public relations and storytelling. And I'm, really pleased to report that those efforts, and thanks to any of you who've helped engage in some of that advocacy or participated in any of these actions, have shown some really significant fruit. We've at least tied HUD's hands for the moment. On the legal front, we saw 22 attorneys general around the country jump in and sue the administration over these changes, calling them unlawful and unconstitutional. Beacon, we ourselves are party to a companion lawsuit to HUD over some HUD COC builds funding. It's a little bit in the weeds that they yanked from us earlier in the year, but sort of telegraphed where they were heading with this. So those legal efforts have borne fruit. The judge has essentially issued a temporary restraining order and has demanded that HUD basically said HUD can't do what HUD wants to do, and they have to come back to the judge with a plan for what they're going to do instead. In the meantime, in the policy and organizing lane, with the congressional appropriation that was passed, I think just last week, there was a appropriation for HUD in that made it clear that at least for the next calendar year, HUD must release its COC funding under the previous pattern and cannot implement what they're trying to implement right now. That at least buys us a year of breathing room as we pivot to local and state advocacy to talk about how we're going to hold these solutions here in Minnesota with or without federal support. And then finally, the PR and storytelling work. This Beacon hosted as a part of this effort, this Losing Sleep, Losing Home vigil, which saw more than 40 congregations, 300 Minnesotans participate in an overnight vigil inspired by a supportive housing resident, Betty Allen, who has really spoken powerfully about how in the midst, every day she looks at the headlines, afraid that the next news story is going to tell her that she's lost her home and she's losing sleep because she's afraid of losing home. That's, you take Betty's story and you multiply it across the 170,000 households, 3,900 households in Minnesota that depend on supportive housing, and you can understand the human stakes and scale of what we're talking about here. Next slide. So I think actually hiding in plain sight under all of this is that we know what works, which is where I started. The fact, for example, that over 400 entities nationwide receiving federal funding have chosen to steer most of this funding towards supportive housing. These precious public dollars underscores its effectiveness. If you go to the next slide. So this is basically just a definition of, what is supportive housing. It's pretty simple. It's not that complicated. It combines deeply affordable, safe, stable housing and permanent housing. That's the permanent and permanent supportive housing with on-site services, which usually involves some sort of professional case management who offer connections either on-site or out in community to mental health, recovery, financial literacy, vocational training, educational or GED attainment, basically anything that residents identify as central to their goals beyond achieving housing stability. These on-site services and case managers exist to assist them with. And the goal is twofold. Number one, it's to help these residents attain and sustain housing stability after oftentimes long histories of homelessness. And then after that, to set them up with what they need to succeed and thrive, both in supportive housing and for many, and this we especially see this to be true in our youth supportive housing, where eventually folks age out, but we also see it in our models that serve individuals exiting homelessness or families overcoming homelessness, to set them up with what they need to succeed beyond supportive housing. And that's a really important part of this story. If you go to the next slide, as such, supportive housing, I think, is best understood as the invisible backbone of our community response to homelessness. It works in tandem with the other legs of the stool. The mixed metaphor is a little bit there. When we think about our community response to homelessness, it's really three legs of the stool. And actually, Hennepin County's whole housing stability division is anchored on these three strategies, each with its own lane of investment with federal, state, and local resources. First leg of that stool is prevention, as I mentioned earlier. These are proactive measures to stop individuals from entering our homelessness system. Second leg of the stool is emergency shelter, which is immediate short-term crisis housing with some services, but I think it's best understood as an emergency response to homelessness. It's best understood almost as the emergency room of our homelessness response system. I think a lot of folks in community, when they think about how we solve homelessness, shelter is the public solution they're most familiar with, so that's where they go. But even if you talk to our shelter providers, and a lot of them have been involved in these advocacy efforts, and a lot of them themselves operate transitional housing and supportive housing, both site-based and scattered site, they'll tell you shelter is not how we end homelessness. You could double the size of our shelter capacity in the Twin Cities metro area, and you would just warehouse twice as many folks experiencing homelessness. How we end homelessness, by definition, is this third leg of the stool. It's through housing. And there's sort of two lanes there. For some overcoming homelessness, it's sufficient to give them a voucher and give them a place to live, and that's all they need. But for some with longer histories of homelessness, and there's sort of federal and state definitions around chronic homelessness, which usually involves both a disability, which is often either a substance use disorder or a mental health issue, and over 12 months of either continuous or episodic homelessness. Providing just a voucher or a place to live is not sufficient. In fact, research shows if you just provide housing to chronically homeless individuals, you have a return to street rate of close to 65 to 70% for most of those folks within a year. But when you provide housing plus case management, housing plus services, this is, in fact, the secret sauce that comes together in supportive housing that leads to a dramatic improvement in outcomes. We see, if you go to the next slide, we talk about how supportive housing is proven and evidence-based, fiscally responsible, regulated, and accountable. So to talk about each of these things, first, proven and evidence-based, there has been countless studies. In fact, there was a study that looked at over 26 studies nationwide that showed that supportive housing is correlated with an 88% reduction in homelessness versus treatment first models, which are more costly and less effective. The success rate when you demand people go through treatment or sign up for job requirements first, which again is where the administration is trying to go, the success rate is only 33%. So it winds up being less effective and more costly. Secondly, fiscally responsible. So you have to, yes, supportive housing. When you provide housing, deep affordability, which usually includes some rent subsidy plus on-site services, does that require a public investment? Sure, it does. But when you put it alongside other systems of what wind up being systems of first response or first resort, because of the inadequacy of our system, specifically emergency rooms and jails, when you look at the cost comparison there is no comparison. Just some data. Supportive housing costs on average, and again, this is based on national studies, about $72 per day per resident, compared to $130 per day for incarceration and $1,200 per day for hospitalization. So in terms of a public return on investment, the why behind why COCs locally have steered a lot of these dollars towards supportive housing, it's because it is the best and highest use of limited public resources. Finally, it's regulated and accountable, and it's publicly accountable by design. Supportive housing is held by organizations like Beacon and our peers that are required to do annual independent financial audits. We're required to have public governing boards and community oversight. We have to report on housing outcomes to HUD and other public funders, which often includes state and local governments, on an annual basis. We have established operating track records and compliance systems. Contrast that with where the administration is trying to take things, with limited transparency and inconsistent oversight. No standardized outcome or housing stability reporting, limited public governance or community accountability, and in many cases, no public governance or community accountability, little or no demonstrated track record in the homelessness services area. And I'll say just candidly, we saw a version of that here in Minnesota with this HSS fraud and the challenges around that. Most of the organizations I've mentioned earlier, including Beacon, we didn't actually utilize HSS because the compliance requirements were so high that we couldn't actually figure out how to reliably pull on it as a billing mechanisms for services in our properties. It was often pop-up LLCs or 501c3s, again, with with no proven track record and no public accountability, that set up shop to figure out how to hoover up these dollars. And that, ironically, is what the administration is proposing to do with this shift in HUD funding, COC funding being run out of Washington rather than steered locally by highly accountable community organizations. Next slide. So what's our opportunity and what is the work ahead of us? I'll start, if you go to the next slide, with Beacon's role in all of this. And I'll just say, since the beginning, a single congregation in South Minneapolis asking how to better love our unhoused neighbors, Beacon has now grown into the largest provider of site-based supportive housing in the state of Minnesota, and a powerful grassroots movement anchored in over 65 now congregations for public systems change in the direction of ending homelessness, with advocacy at federal, state, and local levels. I will say that we, for our part, if you go to the next slide, don't view ourselves as the hero in this story. The heroes in this story are each and every one of you. The heroes in this story are friends and neighbors who stand up to educate themselves about these issues and figure out how to put their voice and their treasure in the direction of ending homelessness in our communities. We really just see ourselves as a facilitator and guide of that work. But that then becomes our role as sort of a convener and catalyst for this effort. As I mentioned, we've grown into the largest provider of site-based supportive housing in the state of Minnesota and a convener of a really powerful statewide movement, especially for any of you that were involved in the Bring It Home Minnesota campaign. You know a version of what, or who have been involved with some of the local advocacy around project approvals like 66 West. You know just how powerful that grassroots advocacy can be. In short, we sort of do three things. We create new homes. We continue to have homes that we have in development or under construction. We serve residents. We now house over 1,500 residents across 24 properties. Over 75% of these units are supportive housing, and we don't provide the services ourselves, but we partner with about 7 nonprofit providers that you'd recognize here in the Twin Cities who partner with us to provide that case management on site. And we change systems. We have over 65 congregations in our advocacy collaborative with a policy and organizing focus on supportive housing, with state and local advocacy, and then just in response, just in the last year to these federal changes, in a widening lane of federal advocacy. Next slide. And so I think this is where I want to end today before we jump into the Q&A with a bit of a call to action to tee up a choice and a call to action for us today and what each of your roles could be if you so choose it. As I said earlier, permanent supportive housing is the invisible backbone of our community response to homelessness. But as such, it is fragile, chronically underfunded, and insufficiently scaled, and therefore it's imperfect. Nobody pretends that any of this works perfectly, but it is indispensable, and we will sure miss it when it's gone. And long before homelessness became a culture war battleground, as it's increasingly becoming in the current moment, Minnesota leaders of decades past have chosen evidence over ideology, investing in supportive housing because it works. And that's why over decades, across Republican and Democratic administrations, Minnesota has quietly and steadily built one of the strongest, most effective, and innovative supportive housing systems in the nation. And together we have proven something revolutionary and simple. Our friends and neighbors overcoming homelessness do not need to be fixed or somehow prove themselves worthy before they're housed. That's what supportive housing makes possible. And so in Minnesota, we face a choice because everything that we've talked about is colliding with a new reality. For the first time in a generation, the federal government is retreating from proven solutions. They're not expanding them or even reforming them. They are trying to eliminate them entirely in favor of a path of criminalization that is less humane, less effective, and more expensive. And I'm just going to give you another staggering data point here. I mentioned before the entirety of the federal investment, or the principal federal investment in homelessness, is that $3.5 billion HUD COC investment. In the big, beautiful bill, there are $45 billion, more than 10 times that much funding for the creation of new detention facilities nationwide. 3.5 billion versus 45 billion. We could functionally end homelessness in this country for $45 billion a year. So don't let anybody tell you that this is about fiscal responsibility. What we have said, and as was reported on that front page of the Star Tribune, these actions do represent a 5-alarm fire for supportive housing and the fellow Minnesotans it serves, which is to say all of us, because all of us are stronger and safer when all of us are housed and supported. And so as Minnesotans, we have a choice. We can wait on Washington, wait on Congress, and wait on the courts while the system we built here in Minnesota unravels around us. Or we can decide together we will not abandon our friends, loved ones, and neighbors overcoming homelessness, and that if Washington won't lead, Minnesota will. We need to build a bridge to the future. We've got a little breathing room here, about a year, as this sorts itself out in Congress and the courts. But we need to build a resilient system here that protects residents, sustains homes, and adequately funds and scales proven solutions. And it's not just about backfilling federal retreat. It is about purpose building the next generation of Minnesota's response to homelessness. So that's the work that we want to invite folks into. And if you go to the next slide, Beacon, in coalition with several other organizations, including Hearth Connection, the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, peer housing organizations, is advancing a pretty bold agenda at the legislature this year. We don't have time to go into all of that today. Maybe some of that comes up into the Q&A. But if you want to both immediately engage your legislators on this topic, you can snap this QR code. That will also, if you elect to, sign you up for Beacon emails. We've got a kickoff at the legislature coming up here later this month. If somebody can post that in the chat. And also a monthly rent is due call to learn a little bit more about this agenda and how you can get involved. But this QR code is a good place to start. That'll at least get you on the list. And I see in the chat there, we've pasted some of that. Secondly, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about what supportive housing looks like in practice, if you go to the next slide, we do have an opportunity to tour 66 West on March 18th. For those of you who have been or would like to visit for the first time, it's a great opportunity to see what supportive housing looks like in action in the lives that it transforms, and why your voice and your generosity is so important in protecting what we've built that works, growing it to adequately meet the scale of the need in our community, and transforming it and purpose building it for a future that all of us can be proud of. And as I often say, what happens next is up to all of us. I think that's where we'll leave things. I had a last slide and a story I'll tell, but I want to leave some time here for Q&A. And also, thanks for your patience today. I've had a standard version of this presentation I've given over the last couple of years since joining Beacon 2 years ago. And I will say, in preparation for today's meeting, I totally reworked the presentation because so much has changed. And so thanks for your patience, as we're still working to polish this presentation. So I'll turn things back over to our moderator, Colleen.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's very good information. And I worked for the VA in Washington back in the late 80s, early 90s, and we had a focus on homeless veterans. It's good to hear that that's made progress, but that's 30 years. So progress does not come quickly, for sure. So thank you very much for all that great information. And I think it's a good time to open it up to questions from the audience. So why don't you raise your hand, or I would prefer you raise your hand and ask the question rather than put it in the chat. But if you want to put it in chat, that's fine too. So anybody have any questions for Chris? Great information. Thank you so much. Well, you must have answered all the questions, Chris.
Well, folks, if folks think of any questions, one thing, just piggybacking off of what you communicated, Colleen, both about veterans homelessness and how long it takes to build this work. One of the things we've learned in our homelessness response is the more targeted and precise the strategies, population-based, the more effective they are. So we've been able to end veterans homelessness in part because of a singular focus on functional zero for veterans homelessness, and then looking at the wide array of both federal, state, and local resources that could be put to use and coordinated to that end. And that's how and why we've gotten to that result. Now, there are more resources federally for unhoused veterans than there are for Americans generally, which is one of the reasons why we've been able to be effective, because we've adequately scaled or more adequately scaled the public investment in veterans homelessness than in other areas. But it offers clues about what could be possible with youth homelessness, family homelessness, chronic homelessness, if we had targeted strategies that were also sufficiently scaled and adequately funded. The second thing you said is just how long it's taken to build that. Yes, it takes years, it takes decades, but it can be unraveled in a single year. And in fact, that's what we're seeing right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see Jean with a question.
Yeah, Jean has a question.
I'm Kathy.
Oh,
Thank you. This is Jean Tracy. I had to join the meeting a bit late, so maybe you addressed this early on. But I'm wondering, maybe too early to tell, but how you think the current situation in Minnesota with the federal things going on here will affect Beacon.
Yeah, so I'll say as we've shifted, so in the midst of this federal retreat and rupture, the argument that we're trying to advance is states like Minnesota, who have been leaders on this for decades, may need to actively contemplate defederalizing our approach to homelessness. In another way of saying that is, if we want a strong and resilient and innovative and adequately funded system, we may no longer be able to rely on the federal government as a trusted partner in this work. So what do we do here in the meantime? That's at the heart of the state and local strategy that Beacon is in the midst of advancing with some peers. In the legislature this coming session, one major point of focus, I mentioned earlier the HSS program, that was the Housing Stability Services. This was the fraud-ridden program that basically used a little bit of Minnesota money, but I'll put a little bit in air quotes, to unlock basically a river of federal Medicaid resources for housing stability. That was the program that was fraud-ridden that I think, have rightfully shut down and mothballed. But what a lot of people don't know is the state's share of that program, as budgeted, was $65 million per year. $65 million per year that we ostensibly had set aside to end homelessness in Minnesota. That is more than 6x what the state currently spends on homelessness. The entire federal HUD-COC investment in Minnesota is about $45 million. So $65 million versus $45 million. My main point is we have the adequate resources here in Minnesota to not only hold what we've built and protect what we've built, but to adequately fund it and even grow it with or without federal support. So that's where we're turning our advocacy next. And that's what you all can be a part of.
Kathy.
You mentioned earlier that you had other projects coming online. Can you tell us a little bit about the ones that you're currently working on, what particular groups they're targeted to, if any, and whether or not they're going to be stalled out in construction because of the current funding crisis?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So a growing edge of Beacon's work has been in family supportive housing. And there's a lot of evidence that not only underscores how important supportive housing is as an effective solution, but the multi-generational impacts in disrupting not only homelessness, but generational poverty when you invest in family supportive housing. And, just in the last year and a half or so, we've opened Vista 44 in Hopkins, my hometown. We've opened Emerson Village in North Minneapolis. We literally just opened the doors on Prairie Point in Shakopee, sort of in the far southwest suburbs. And we have coming online in hopefully we'll break ground on this within the next year, Gladstone Crossing, which is family supportive housing in Maplewood. That's just a little thumbnail sketch. There's others in our development. I will say we did see some disruption. So for two projects, Astor Commons in Richfield, which we're still figuring out if there's a path to get that one done, and Gladstone Crossing, which I just mentioned. There was a special federal program called HUD-COC Builds, where Beacon was among only 11 organizations nationally that received this hyper-competitive HUD award, totaling about $5 million across those two developments that HUD pulled in August. That was actually the basis of the first lawsuit, and also it was sort of a canary in the coal mine moment where we understood what HUD was likely going to be doing with the broader COC investment. I will say what that means for Astor and Gladstone, respectively. For Astor, our paths to making that one happen have been pretty narrow, and losing this funding narrowed those paths further to the point where it's hard to see that one happening now. We're still in discernment around that. So there is a direct federal impact there. For Gladstone, what it'll mean is we'll have fewer resources to serve those residents, but the capital stack, those are the dollars for the bricks and mortar, are intact and in place, and that won't affect our ability to get that one under construction. We'll just have fewer resources to serve the residents there. Yeah, I see Joni. You'll have to go off mute though.
Joni, your mic's off.
I have a question about the amount of support is represented by the number of congregations. In my knowledge of Beacon, at one point there were almost 100 congregations involved, and you said now 65. And can you tell us a little bit about what happens? I know that there's been expansion beyond, starting with Plymouth, expansion deep into the suburbs, first, second, third ring. But how does that number fluctuate, and how does it affect your work?
Yeah, thanks, Joni. So I think it reflects over the last couple of years. You mentioned, I think as recently as a couple of years ago, we talked about having roughly 100 congregations in our collaborative. Now we say 65. In part, it's because we've updated our definitions about what it means to be a part of the collaborative. We now have 5 principal ways that congregations can partner. And we've gone back around to our congregations just to make sure that they're on board with one or more of these approaches. So we've done some work sort of deepening our relationships with a core set of congregations and getting a little bit more clear around what it means to be a part of the collaborative. I don't have this link queued up and ready to go, but maybe that's something we can circulate if somebody can pull it up, or we can send around later. But for any of you that are a part of a congregation, whether a Beacon congregation or not, these are the pathways that congregations can use to participate. So, what I would say, Joni, is it hasn't actually represented like a, precipitous like decline in the number of congregations. It's more an update to our own definitions. Though we do, of course, see congregations come and go.
Sure. I'm wondering if COVID made a big difference. And then also the Families Moving Forward program. Is that still a part of
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. So that's, oh, go ahead, Elizabeth, if you want to hop in.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think that was I was going to add, before you even mentioned that, Joni, I was going to add to your response, Chris, that I think there were a number of congregations whose primary engagement with Beacon was through being hosts through the Families Moving Forward program.
Yes.
That program is still intact. It transformed a lot during COVID, but then we also, through very careful discernment, decided that was not one of the kind of lanes where we could really have the greatest impact. So we decided to kind of double down on our policy and our permanent supportive housing work, and very thoughtfully transition that program to another provider who is currently operating that program in the Scott and Carver County area. But I think that does some congregations dropping off a bit because they were only interested in that.
And that was church-based shelter, I think, for people who aren't as familiar with the work. So
yes, that's right.
Made a huge difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for elevating that, and also underscores how dramatically shifting federal priorities can affect the landscape and the array of housing solutions in our community. So one of the reasons why we were able to transition in Scott and Carver is because they continued to prioritize it with some funding, even though there's been through COVID. Before COVID, there was a pretty significant federal investment in sort of this scattered site shelter model rather than congregant shelter settings. Through COVID, a lot of that unraveled. And in Hennepin and Ramsey in particular, they just didn't continue funding those programs. So the source of funding to make that even a viable model went away. And again, it sort of underscores how invisibly behind the scenes, so much of what we wind up seeing organizations like Beacon and others even be able to provide in our community is held together by, yes, community investment and private contributions and individual dollars and philanthropy, but a big part of it is quasi-government. It only exists because there are fulsome federal, state, and local resources to make it possible. And in fact, this summer, as we were trying to orient our community to understanding the role of federal funding in homelessness solutions. We described it as a Jenga tower. If you've played that childhood game before, where you've got, bricks stacked on top of each other. And we got one of these big Jenga towers that you may have seen, put it up on a stool, and on each of the bricks, we wrote federal, state, local, or community to help people understand the intersecting role that these various funding streams play in creating a stable homelessness response, and how if you pull any individual brick out of that, the whole thing gets wobbly. And I think the same story could be said of sort of ultimately what's happened with this scattered site family shelter model that Beacon used to play a more significant role in.
Chris, I don't see any other questions, but I have one. And I didn't know that the big, beautiful bill included $45 billion for detention facilities. But I do know that detention facilities are being sought around the country. And I want to mention that the League is going to be having something coming up in the not too distant future about detention facilities. And, they may be for immigrants, or who knows what group would be next to be put in a detention facility, or homeless, or, or whatever. Keep your eyes open on detention facilities, I would say. I think that in the $45 billion, would that, in your estimation, Chris, would that be only $45 billion for homeless housing, or do you know?
So my understanding is that in the big, beautiful bill, there's $45 billion for detention facilities that's principally focused on creating new detention facilities. Ostensibly, the administration has described this as a part of its overall immigration enforcement response, but we're already seeing some of these dollars flow to communities like Salt Lake City, where in fact they are setting up detention facilities that are for their efforts to criminalize homelessness. So, it's where with one hand, HUD is trying to take away what is a pretty modest annual investment, $3.5 billion annually in homelessness response, principally supportive housing, housing first, and they are trying to stand up these facilities, and they're wrapping all of this in a veneer of, oh well, we want folks to seek treatment, we want folks to get jobs, we want that too. To be clear, that's a feature of what we do in supportive housing. It's just all of the evidence points to that if you want that for folks, you need to get them stably housed first. So it feels like a bit of a canard that, you of course you go to somebody on the street and you say, hey, you can't sleep here, but I've got a pop-up LLC that's now providing job skills training and mental health supports that if you got to avail yourself of that. And if you don't, we're going to take you to the detention facility up the road. I mean, that's in fact where we're seeing this head, and I'd say the canary in the coal mine on this, and where the detention facility conversation is heading next, is around homelessness for sure. And Salt Lake City is sort of your case study on that right now.
Thank you. And $45 billion is a lot. There is a group in Baltimore. It's called Project Saltbox, and they are focusing on warehouses around the country that have been purchased to be detention facilities. I think there's 7 that were purchased. 5, the community pushed back and said, we don't want to have a detention facility in our community. And there's 11 warehouses, big warehouses, that are still for sale. Stay tuned. We'll let you know when we have something about detention facilities in the League, just so people know about it, because that's something that, even if ICE goes not out of Minnesota, but calms down in Minnesota, the whole country is facing that issue. So thank you, Chris, for that.
Yeah, well, I just want to say, I think there's obviously folks who are concerned about these facilities, because of their lack of accountability and cruelty. But I think anybody who even cares about just how tax dollars are used, just fiscal responsibility, should have real concerns about fiscal responsibility, and frankly, fraud should have real concerns about a handful of political appointees in Washington getting to make decisions around billions and billions of dollars steered to whom? Mostly for-profit private entities that have zero, they don't have public boards, they don't have to do, annual audits. There's this massive public accountability issue here too, in addition to just at face value, sort of the concerns about human dignity and cruelty.
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you, Chris. Are there any other questions? Let me see if I have, let me get back to the gallery view. And are there any other questions from the audience? I keep getting out of that. Oh, well. Any other questions from the audience?
Helene, if there aren't, is it okay if I chime in quickly?
Yes.
I know we're over time, but
Yes.
As I mentioned, my role at Beacon is in fundraising, and I would not be doing my job if I didn't just. I know Chris talked a little bit about some of the increased gaps that we're facing, but on a good day or in a typical environment, Beacon has to fundraise about $8,000 on average just to provide the support services and costs for a single household over the course of a year. It varies depending on the population, depending on the building, and depending on the very complicated funding structure that each project has, but 8,000 is the average. So I just think that's a helpful number, just to really kind of get your head around what it takes to raise the money that really ensures that our residents are not just housed and surviving in housing, but they're actually able to stay stable, which means also staying housed. That's why, permanent supportive housing is so effective, because you need to have those other things in place just to be able to stay in your home. So I know some of you are already Beacon donors, and we're super grateful for that. And I did just drop the donation link in the chat. If you are not yet a Beacon donor and want to consider it, I'm happy to talk with anybody that would like more information, but just wanted to kind of put in a quick plug.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for having us today.
Colleen, can I say something? Charlie and I have been going to the Rent is Due Zoom calls for the last, I don't know, year and a half. How long have they been going on? And I will tell you that it is the best half-hour meeting I have ever been to. Ben runs those. They're always on time. You get a little bit of information. You get maybe introduced to someone from another organization, and then you get an action to do. The meeting is always 30 minutes. The action takes maybe another 5 minutes, and you have done something worthwhile. It is really easy, and it's my easiest action that I do.
We did not pay Barb to say any of that.
We'll pass that encouragement on to our policy and organizing team too. Thanks, Barb. Really appreciate it.
And the rent is due. Did you put a link in chat on that, or?
I think we did, but I'll drop another one.
Okay, thanks. My screen's a little weird right now. So anyway, okay. Well, I think if there's no other questions or comments, thank you very much, Chris and Elizabeth and Jake, all of you that put this together, and we really appreciate it. And we'll keep making Minnesota in the forefront on supportive housing. Thank you for all the work on that. And everyone have a very good, it's a sunny day. I know Joni's not in Minnesota, but it's a sunny day in Minnesota. So everyone enjoy a sunny day. And thank you for attending.
Thank you.